Welcome to part 2, where we are going to talk about your sensory systems. So, our 5 senses, your taste, touch, sight, smell, and sound here. So, we're going to talk about how stimuli, which is like things that happen, sound, noise, taste, something you eat, how it interacts with where it touches, and how that information is sent to the brain, and how the brain creates a response based on the sensory system input that it receives. So we'll start with the visual system, your eyes. So 70% of the body's sensory receptors are in the eye. That is important because the eye not only tells you what is going on and tells you what you see, but it also, through light, can produce different neurotransmitters that can make you feel sleepy, feel awake, like in the daytime, and other feelings based on the light input and other things in the eye, which we will cover more in depth later. So let's first cover the main areas of the eye involved in processing information. So the pupil is the circle, and that's where the light enters the eye. The iris is there to regulate the amount of light that enters so it can constrict or expand. You can squint or widen your eyes to try to see better. Photoreceptors are inside the retina, which is the lining around the eye that contains the photoreceptors, which are divided into rods or cones, which are responsible for different things. So rods catch your peripheral vision, and they take things in black and white, while cones, which is in the retina, these receptors manage color, detail, and other information about what you see. The optic nerve is basically similar to the spinal cord, where it will take the stimuli received from the eye to the brain area related to that. So then the stimuli will travel through the optic nerve into the brain cell. So it will first travel to the thalamus and then to the primary visual cortex, which is where what we see is translated into a mental image and telling you what about it and everything about it. So that is how the eye receives input and the pathway it takes to the brain. Next, we have the auditory system, so hearing. So major parts of that are the pinna or auricle, which is the outside of your ear, which is shaped so that sound will be passed into the ear canal, where the next part it encounters is the eardrum, also known as the tympanic membrane. So then the sound comes to the eardrum, and after the eardrum, there is what's called a cochlea, similar in appearance to a snail. And between the eardrum and the cochlea are 3 parts called the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. And these are important because when sound comes in, it boom, boom, vibrates, causes vibrations on the eardrum. So that's also part of why it's called a drum, boom, boom. And this sound is carried from the malleus to the incus, boom, ding, donk, which is why it's called a hammer and anvil, because it works like that based on sound entering the eardrum and the vibration. Then into the labyrinth there is fluid, that will help you determine direction and where you are in space. Then the cochlea is made up of 3 small chambers, which have lots of fibers, which translate and interpret the sounds that we hear into messages to send to the brain. The brain will use both ears to determine where a sound is coming from, how based off the volume and the pitch and tone, and it can detect where it's coming from, where it's going, based on both ears. And that works together with the fluid inside the auditory canal. And so the pathway it goes to the brain, it first enters the ear canal, vibrates against the eardrum, then the inner ear, the cochlea, filled with fluid that will shift based on the vibrations, which is then sent to the brain and the auditory cortex, where the brain deciphers what is heard, what it means, and then will process a response, an action potential based on if it's necessary or not. Then we have smell or olfaction. And so this comes from odors. The key components are so in the olfactory system, we have the olfactory epithelium, which is the lining in your nose that has mucus and tiny hair receptors that can take in the odor, translate it into a signal that will relay to the brain what that smell is. So another part is the cilia. Those detect the smell, and then they bind to receptors. Molecules are detected, translating, and then converted to electrical signals sent through the olfactory nerve to the olfactory bulb, and from there to the olfactory cortex in the brain, which is in charge of all the smells and odors and interpreting them and creating a response based on the smell. So it also sends and receives feedback from the olfactory cortex to and from the cerebral cortex. So that's how smell works. Then we have taste. So the main components in our taste pathway are the taste bud cells. So that's in your tongue. That's where your tongue first senses what it tastes like. Then there are taste receptors, which will interpret the taste and into something specific, like what is it? What does it taste like? Then they go through cranial nerves to the brainstem or medulla, which connects to the brain's pathways, sending it to the thalamus, then on to the gustatory cortex, which is the brain area responsible for receiving input about what you tasted, what it tastes like, and interpreting that for the brain. And now we have something interesting. So both the sense of smell and taste were processed first through the orbital frontal cortex. And this is very interesting because the orbital frontal cortex interprets signals from both the nose and taste buds. So taste and smell are processed there. And studies have found out that the orbifrontal cortex can regulate senses of odors, tastes, and flavors, and can compute them. Are they beneficial? Are they good? Are they bad? And for example, the brain will perceive some repulsive odors if you're eating a food such as, for me, smelly tofu. It smells terrible. Maybe Durian is a better example. Smells terrible. And some people love to eat it. So usually when you smell something like that, your brain will say, no, I don't want it. However, the brain has also developed to associate texture and certain tastes when detected. So even though the smell is telling you spit it out, the taste buds trigger a different emotion to inhibit the disgust response to the smell and let the body just experience the taste. So it's very interesting how the orbitofrontal cortex can give some people a feeling of deliciousness, like when my lovely wife eats stomach, which is a delicacy for many people. I am disgusted by the texture, but she really enjoys it. So the body has grown accustomed to different textures of food based off our personal experiences. So some people could taste something soggy and want to gag. Some people could taste something soggy and think is yummy based on their personal experiences. So odors are special in that they can be interpreted differently by different people, odors and taste. And also, something special about smell is that it interacts with the hypothalamus and amygdala, which is in charge of memory and some emotions, your fear center. So that's how some odors, some smells can trigger emotions or trigger you to recall certain events in your life because that specific smell was stored in the hypothalamus, and when you smell that, it brought that memory back. And also about taste, there are 5 specific type of taste receptors. There's salty, sweet, sour, umami, which is meat, and bitter. And salty foods have a high threshold, meaning the food we eat must have a lot of salt for us to be able to detect it, because salt probably has a very high tolerance. Same with sweet, has the second highest threshold. And then with a taste such as sour or bitter, the brain will actually sometimes cause you to gag or want to spit out what you're eating, because bitter or sourness can be associated with rottenness or even poison. So it's very interesting how these sensory inputs and the brain interact based on experiences, memory, and working together. Okay, now we'll talk about touch areas and the pathway. So we feel things through our skin, which is called cutaneous senses. And so the parts important in touch and its reception in the brain is the cerebral cortex. So that is filled with neurotransmitters, helping them send to and from, making sure everything operates smoothly. Then the somatosensory cortex is important because it's in charge of your physical feelings, and everything you feel, touch, will be sent to that part of the brain. It has a map of your anatomy and knows about where your hands are and feet are and helps to control that. Also in the brain, there's the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, which helps about fine touch specifically. So there are all these areas in the brain. Each has its specific function to help your body respond to stimuli and produce and create responses. So hand will respond to touch by triggering neurons. So neurons will be sent from the hand where something touched you to the spinal cord, and then through the spinal cord to the medulla or the brainstem, and then to the thalamus and the somatosensory cortex. And that's the route that touch goes to the brain. Now about pain and temperature. So pain and temperature both follow the same pathway. However, there are different receptors that are there to interpret pain or temperature. So pain will respond from nociceptors in the skin, which will take the pain feeling, send the signal to the spinal cord, up the spinal cord, and to the sensory cortex to interpret and analyze and decide what to do in response. Temperature, so how hot or cold something is determined by thermoreceptors in the skin, which go through the same pathway from the skin, spinal cord, to the medulla, crossing over at the brainstem, and to the sensory cortex. Now we have proprioception and kinesthesia. So proprioception is the awareness of where your body is, your position in space. So this can really help in high-level sports, where a ball is flying and your body is determining where it will be and trying to be there to get the ball. So proprioception is in charge of like high-level sports and your body knowing where something will be and creating a response for that. Kinesthesia is very similar, but it's the awareness of body movement and muscle memory. So this is more unconscious and muscle memory, like reflexes, than actual consciously choosing to make actions. So kinesthetic signals will be sent from muscles or sensory places to the brain for the brain to receive that and then prepare whatever response is necessary. So proprioception is awareness of your position in space and where something will be. Kinesthesia is body movement and muscle memory. And that is all for the sensory. Feel free to check out the references list because there are a lot of sources for this topic that are probably much better than listening to me to learn about this if you want to dive deeper into one of these topics. All right, tune in for part 3. I hope you enjoyed this.